Sodom and Gomorrah, two cities whose destruction became an eternal symbol of divine wrath, faced a fate that few other civilizations have seen. Immorality reigned with such intensity that God decided to intervene directly and mercilessly. This destruction was not just an act of force, but a clear message about the limits humanity should not exceed. And it is interesting to reflect. What can lead an entire civilization to such a great moral collapse that it justifies divine action? When we reflect on the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, we realize that it was not an act of arbitrariness, but an inevitable consequence. The history of these cities is one of the best known, especially due to their strong symbolism within the biblical narrative. Moral decay reached alarming levels, and even if the people were warned, their corruption was such that there was no room for repentance. When we think about today, it is not difficult to find parallels with current human behavior. Excessive indulgences, disregard for values, and unbridled selfishness often make us wonder, are we approaching the same line? What we learn from the story of divine punishment is that there's a price to pay when a society sinks into its own sins, and that price can be high. Many believe that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was a sudden decision, but in fact, it was the culmination of a series of ongoing transgressions. God, in his infinite patience, watched as the people ignored any attempt at change. If we put this into a modern perspective, we can think about how many times we avoid doing what we know is right, justifying our actions with empty excuses. Perhaps, if we reflect on what led Sodom and Gomorrah to ruin, we can understand that the true lesson lies in self-awareness, recognizing one's mistakes before it is too late. Divine punishment should not only be seen as an act of destruction, but also as a cleansing. The evil that had infiltrated these cities had become so profound that the only solution was to completely eliminate its existence. It's like when something in your life deteriorates to such an extent that the only way to move forward is to nip it in the bud. We can think about the situations we have experienced where we had to make difficult decisions to preserve what was good in ourselves or in our lives. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah reminds us that sometimes the only path to rebirth is through the eradication of that which is corrupt. It is fascinating how the story of Sodom and Gomorrah transcends its time and place. She tells us about human nature and the dangers of straying from what is morally right. Of course, the specific circumstances of that time may seem far from our reality, but the essence remains the same. And here comes a practical reflection. What are we doing in our daily lives that could be moving us away from the principles that, deep down, we know are correct? Small transgressions can accumulate over time, leading to greater consequences than we could imagine. The moral of the story is not just the punishment itself, but the path that led to this outcome. When Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, there was no more room for mercy. The inhabitants had completely lost the ability to redeem themselves. And this makes us question, are we paying attention to the warnings that life sends us? Sometimes the universe gives us signs that we are on the wrong path, but it is up to us to decide whether to ignore them or change direction. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was, above all, a conscious rejection of divine values and laws. The sins of Sodom and Gomorrah were not simple transgressions. They had become an integral part of the culture of those cities. And that is exactly why the destruction was so complete. When evil is deeply rooted in a society, a simple correction is not enough. This makes us wonder, to what extent are we allowing error to become normalized in our daily lives? Small mistakes, when not corrected, can turn into habits, and these habits, in turn, into a lifestyle that takes us away from what is correct. The lesson we learn from Sodom and Gomorrah goes beyond physical destruction. It tells us about the nature of divine justice, which is relentless but fair. The fact that God gave cities several opportunities to redeem themselves before destroying them shows us that there is always a chance for change. The question is, are we ready to take advantage of these chances when they arise? Or do we, like the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, ignore the signs and head toward disaster? Reflecting on this story makes us think about our own lives and how we can avoid the same fate. Interestingly, The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not just a lesson for those who lived at that time. It has become a universal warning, a symbol of what happens when sin becomes the norm. Morality may seem like an antiquated concept to some, but the consequences of ignoring it are as real as they were thousands of years ago. When we look at modern society, it is impossible not to draw parallels. We may not see the physical destruction around us, but the collapse of values and principles can be just as devastating. With this, we can move on to the next point, where we will see that even in the midst of so much corruption, there were still those who cared about the righteous. In the midst of all the decadence of Sodom and Gomorrah, there was a moment of intercession, a cry for justice. Abraham, knowing the imminent fate of the cities, questioned God with admirable boldness. What if there are 50 righteous people? Abraham reduced the number, trying to find the slightest reason to spare those who might still be innocent. This moment is a profound example of compassion and hope. Abraham was not indifferent to suffering, and his act of interceding for the righteous makes us wonder, to what extent do we care about the fate of those around us? Can we, like Abraham, be an active voice in the face of injustice? This episode teaches us a valuable lesson, the power of intercession. When we see someone facing difficulties, whether at work, in personal relationships, or in larger societal issues, we have the choice to be indifferent or to become intercessors. Abraham was no ordinary man. He involved himself in the problems of those around him, even though he knew that most were far from redemption. Likewise, we have the power to make a difference in people's lives, whether with a word of support, practical action, or even defending those who cannot defend themselves. Abraham's request to God reveals something even deeper to us. Divine justice is always accompanied by mercy. God was willing to spare Sodom and Gomorrah if there were 10 righteous people. This makes us reflect on the role of kindness in the midst of corruption. Could it be that even when everything seems lost, is there something good worth preserving? Often in our lives, we are quick to condemn situations or people, but we forget that within the chaos there can be small signs of virtue. The question is, are we paying attention to them? Abraham's persistence in questioning God, asking him to spare the cities, is an example of faith in action. It was not just a one-off request, but a continuous search for a merciful answer. This stance shows us that, in our lives, we should not give up easily on people or situations that seem irremediable. Sometimes, it is our persistence and faith that can make the difference. Abraham believed that kindness, no matter how small, deserved a chance. And this makes us wonder, how many times do we give up on something or someone when there is still potential for change? There is something deeply human in Abraham's attitude. He knew that most of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were beyond redemption, but he still tried to save the righteous. This teaches us not to lose sight of the value of the individual, even in the midst of collective corruption. In today's world, we may feel powerless in the face of so many injustices and problems, but it is essential to remember that, like Abraham, we can make a difference, even if it is for just one person. And this difference, however small it may seem, can have a profound impact. Abraham also shows us the importance of questioning, of not blindly accepting things as they are. He questioned God, not because of a lack of faith, but because he believed in goodness and justice. We often find ourselves in situations where we are afraid to question what seems unfair or incorrect. But Abraham gives us a clear example of how questioning can be a form of faith, a search for a deeper understanding of divine justice. And so, we are invited to reflect. Are we willing to question what seems wrong to us, or do we simply accept things as they are? Another interesting point is how Abraham's intercession reflects our own ability to influence the course of events. In our lives, we cannot always control what happens, but we can act on behalf of others, seeking justice and kindness wherever possible. Just like Abraham, we can be defenders of those who have no voice, offering our help, our support, our intercession. This is one of the biggest lessons from this episode: the power of a single individual to make a difference for many. Divine mercy, so present in the negotiation between Abraham and God, reminds us that no matter how lost situations seem, there is always room for redemption. Abraham believed this. And in our lives, how many times do we dismiss the possibility of change because we believe it is already too late? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us that until the last moment, there is a chance, a window of hope, even when everything seems to be falling apart. Are we taking advantage of these opportunities for redemption in our own lives? Although God accepted Abraham's request, the final outcome reveals something profound. Even justice and intercession have their limits. There were not enough righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah to be spared. And this makes us think about the importance of cultivating kindness and justice in our own lives. Abraham's request shows us that kindness, when present, can have an impact that goes far beyond ourselves. However, when it is absent, the consequences are inevitable. We cannot depend on others to be fair. We must start with ourselves. Now that we understand Abraham's crucial role as an intercessor, we move on to reflect on the transgressions that led to Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. Among the reasons for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, 5 major transgressions stand out that mark the moral decline of these cities: violence, sexual perversion, pride, idolatry, and inhospitality. These sins did not appear overnight, but grew, taking over the minds and hearts of the inhabitants. Violence, for example, has become the norm, with brutal acts being seen as commonplace. When a society begins to treat violence as something commonplace, it is a clear sign that it has lost its way. We can see this reflected in our modern world, where news of aggression and abuse emerges daily, often without us realizing the destructive impact of it. Sexual perversion was also rampant, to the point where the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah completely lost their sense of morality in their relationships. This behavior was so ingrained that when God's angels visited Lot, the crowd demanded to have relations with them, demonstrating the depth of the corruption. In our lives, what we can learn is that when we lose control over our desires, allowing them to govern our actions, we leave rationality and ethics aside. The unbridled search for pleasure, without limits or responsibilities, can take us to places from which it is difficult to return. Pride was another great transgression of these cities. The inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah saw themselves as superior, despising any idea of humility or service to others. This pride led them to believe that they were above divine laws, that nothing could touch them. When we allow pride to dominate our attitudes, we move away from empathy and a sense of community. We think we are self-sufficient, when in fact, we are interdependent. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us that exaggerated pride can be the harbinger of downfall, both individual and collective. Idolatry was also a fundamental transgression. They worshiped false gods and placed their faith in material things, completely ignoring the worship of the true God. It makes us think about our own lives. How often do we place our hopes and expectations on things that have no real value, like money, status, or power? The history of these cities reminds us that when we take God out of the center of our lives and put in temporary things, we are heading for ruin. Idolatry is a way of diverting from the greater purpose and focusing on what is ephemeral. Inhospitality, perhaps the most underestimated sin, was also one of the reasons that led to the destruction of these cities. The act of receiving visitors with violence and contempt, instead of welcoming them with kindness and generosity, was the final straw. At that time, and even today in many cultures, hospitality is considered sacred. And this leads us to a practical reflection. How do we treat others, especially those who are in a vulnerable position? Being hospitable doesn't just mean opening the doors of your home, but also being welcoming, supportive, and empathetic in our daily interactions. These 5 transgressions, violence, sexual perversion, pride, idolatry, and inhospitality, are a devastating combination. When a society allows these sins to become deeply rooted, it begins to destroy itself, even before any external punishment. We can see this in many societies throughout history. Civilizations that flourished, but when they deviated from morality, they ended up declining. It makes us think about the current state of the world and how, in some ways, we are repeating the same mistakes as Sodom and Gomorrah. An important point here is that these sins did not just affect the individuals who committed them, but had a collective impact. Corruption was so widespread that no one escaped its consequences. When we allow acts of injustice and immorality to prevail in our communities, we are contributing to a cycle of destruction. So how can we break this cycle? Perhaps the answer lies in cultivating opposing values. Peace instead of violence, humility instead of pride, empathy instead of inhospitality. Small individual acts can eventually generate big changes. We often look at stories like Sodom and Gomorrah and think that these events are far from our reality. However, if we reflect carefully, we will see that the same sins that led to the destruction of these cities are present in different forms in our modern world. Violence, pride, material idolatry, and a lack of empathy still permeate our societies. This leads us to a question. What are we doing to avoid the same fate? Are we learning from past mistakes, or are we unconsciously repeating them? As we look at the 5 transgressions of Sodom and Gomorrah, we are challenged to reflect on our own behaviors and values. These sins are not just historical accounts, but representations of human failures that can strike us at any time. The point is that we have the choice to change, to cultivate virtues that can steer us away from this dark destiny. And that's the real lesson we can take from this story. As long as there is room for reflection and change, there is still hope. Now that we understand the transgressions that led to the fall of these cities, we come to the symbolic point of this destruction and what it represents. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is much more than a historical event. It represents a powerful symbol of divine justice and the cleansing of evil. When these cities were consumed by fire, it was not just an act of physical punishment, but a clear example of how corruption, when taken to the extreme, meets its inevitable end. It is interesting to note that this destruction was not arbitrary, but loaded with meaning. She shows us that when evil becomes systemic and impenetrable, the end is certain. The fire that fell from the sky serves as a reminder that justice, even if delayed, is relentless. Just as the flames destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, the symbolism of this event applies to many situations in our lives. How often do we see situations that seem unshakable, where injustice and evil are so entrenched that they seem immune to any change? The destruction of these cities reminds us that no matter how immutable something seems, justice will always find a way. In our own context, this may mean that no matter how out of control or irreversible a situation may seem, the forces of justice and righteousness have the ability to bring about drastic and often unexpected change. Fire, often used in the Bible as a symbol of purification, also has this meaning here. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah can be seen as a kind of cleansing, where everything that was impure and corrupt was eradicated. This concept of purification by fire appears in several religious traditions, always with the idea that evil must be completely eliminated so that something new and pure can emerge. We can apply this idea to our own lives. There are times when a symbolic fire is needed to clean up what is wrong, thus allowing a fairer and more integral start. Another important point about the destruction of these cities is that it was a warning to future generations. God not only destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, he left the story recorded so that everyone could learn from it. The event then becomes a living example that evil and corruption have real consequences. What we can take away from this lesson is that our actions have weight not only for us, but for those who come after. The history of these cities endures today as a reminder that when a society strays from moral principles, it eventually reaps what it sowed. Furthermore, the symbolic destruction of these cities reveals a universal truth. Morality and justice transcend time and culture. Although this story took place in a period very different from ours, the lessons it brings are timeless. Violence, corruption, and inequity continue to be problems in modern society, and the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah continues to be a warning. It makes us reflect on our own society and what we are willing to tolerate. Are we ready to let corruption proliferate to the point of destruction, or will we be proactive in correcting course? There is another aspect to this destruction that deserves our attention, The idea that for the new to emerge, the old and corrupt must be eliminated. This is true on both a personal and social level. We often hold on to situations, habits, or even systems that we know are broken, but we are afraid to let go. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah reminds us that for something better to emerge, the old and immoral must be completely removed. Thus, we can see this event as a metaphor for renewal, where the end of something bad can pave the way for something infinitely better. The destruction of these cities was also an act of retribution, but at the same time, an act of preventive justice. By destroying these cities, God was not only punishing the evil that had already been committed, but also preventing that evil from spreading further. This leads us to reflect on the concept of preventive justice in our own lives. Oftentimes, fixing a problem early can prevent bigger disasters in the future. Whether in our personal relationships, at work, or in other areas of life, identifying and eradicating problems before they become uncontrollable can prevent much greater destruction. The symbolism of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is also present in the way it occurred. Fire and sulfur, elements that leave nothing behind. This makes us think about the nature of radical changes. When something really needs to be transformed or eliminated, there should be no remains of its old form. We often try to make gradual changes, leaving parts of the old system or behavior, but the example of these cities shows us that, in extreme cases, the change needs to be total and complete. This is the true power of a complete transformation. Finally, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah reminds us that there are limits to divine patience and tolerance of corruption. God gave these cities time to change their ways, but the evil was so deep-rooted that there was no turning back. This makes us reflect on our own lives and the time we have to correct our mistakes. We can wait until the consequences are inevitable, or we can take preventive measures and change while there is still time. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a powerful warning. Do not leave until tomorrow the correction of what is wrong today. Understanding the symbolism of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, we now turn our attention to the social decay that led to this tragic point. The decline of Sodom and Gomorrah is a classic example of how material prosperity can lead to moral decay. Cities were in a phase of great wealth and abundance, but this prosperity caused their inhabitants to move away from fundamental values such as humility, generosity, and empathy. When a society begins to focus exclusively on its own desires and luxuries, leaving aside compassion for those most in need, it enters a process of self-destruction. This makes us reflect on today's world, where in many places, unrestrained consumption and individualism seem to be increasingly rooted. It is interesting to note how the story of Sodom and Gomorrah reflects a universal truth. Moral decadence is often accompanied by material excess. The more people become attached to comfort and luxury, the more likely they are to neglect social and spiritual responsibilities. Pride grows, compassion diminishes, and inequality becomes an increasingly glaring reality. This pattern repeats itself throughout history, and the example of these cities serves as a warning that prosperity without purpose or responsibility can be as dangerous as extreme poverty. The prosperity of Sodom and Gomorrah caused its inhabitants to become arrogant and self-sufficient. They believed their material success was proof that they were on the right path, when in fact they were falling into a moral abyss. We often confuse wealth with virtue, believing that those who have more resources are somehow more deserving. However, this story reminds us that the true value of a society lies not in its possessions, but in how it treats its weakest and most vulnerable. Ignoring this responsibility is paving the way for a fall. Indulgence also played a central role in the decline of these cities. The unbridled search for pleasure and personal satisfaction led the inhabitants to completely move away from moral principles. They lived for their own desires, without worrying about the consequences of their actions. This behavior, in addition to destroying social bonds, corrupted people's own souls, making them insensitive to the suffering of others. This is a danger we still face today, where hedonism and the search for immediate pleasure often take the place of reflection and responsibility. Another consequence of unbridled prosperity was arrogance. When the people of Sodom and Gomorrah began to believe that they were invincible and that nothing could shake them, they distanced themselves from any notion of humility or the need for change. This type of mentality is dangerous as it creates a false sense of security where the person or society believes they can continue in their corrupt ways without facing any consequences. However, history shows us that arrogance is often the harbinger of destruction. This kind of blind pride prevents any possibility of redemption. Furthermore, the disregard for those most in need was one of the most serious moral failures of these cities. While the elites lived in luxury and opulence, the poor and vulnerable were completely ignored. There was no room for solidarity or compassion, and those who needed help most were often overlooked. This type of behavior is a clear violation of the principles of justice and equality that should govern any society. When a community refuses to care for its most vulnerable members, it loses its soul, becoming just an empty shell of material wealth. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah challenges us to look at our own lives and societies. Are we also falling into the trap of prosperity without responsibility? Are we only caring about our immediate desires, ignoring those around us? The lessons of these ancient cities still resonate today, especially in a world where inequality is rising and individualism is becoming the norm. Moral decay begins when we move away from the values that hold society together, and material prosperity, without a moral purpose, can accelerate this process. It is important to remember that the moral decline of these cities was not a sudden event. It was the result of years of indulgence, arrogance, and neglect. Small daily choices, made by thousands of people, eventually led to complete destruction. It makes us think about how our own everyday choices can contribute to the strength or decline of our communities. Perhaps the real lesson here is that we must be vigilant in our actions, never underestimating the impact our small decisions can have in the long term. Finally, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us that social decay is ultimately self-destructive. A society that neglects its fundamental values and allows corruption, violence, and immorality to take root is doomed to fall. There is no need for divine punishment to occur. Society itself will end up destroying itself from the inside out. What can we do, then, to avoid this fate? Perhaps the answer lies in a return to compassion, justice, and caring for others, values that can prevent prosperity from turning into decay. Now that we understand the impact of social decay, we turn our attention to the figure of Lot and his role in this tragic scenario. Lot, Abraham's nephew, is a central figure in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. He was a man who, despite living amidst the corruption of these cities, tried to maintain his principles of hospitality and kindness. When the angels sent by God arrived in Sodom, Lot immediately welcomed them into his home, offering them protection. In the culture of that time, hospitality was one of the most sacred virtues, and Lot was willing to defend it at any cost, even in the face of hostility from his neighbors. This act reveals a moral greatness that contrasts with the degraded environment in which he lived. Lot's decision to protect his guests, even offering his daughters to the people, may seem shocking to us today, but it is important to understand the cultural context. In that society, the honor of protecting guests was so high that Lot was willing to make unthinkable sacrifices to ensure their safety. This also shows how far the inhabitants of Sodom had strayed from basic moral values. While Lot attempted to fulfill his duty as host, the crowd around him was consumed with depravity, so profound that no value or decency seemed to remain. It is interesting to note that although Lot acted righteously in protecting the angels, he was still not completely free from fault. He hesitated when the angels told him to flee the city, and had to be literally led by the hand to escape the impending disaster. This shows us that even those who try to follow the path of righteousness can sometimes falter or hesitate when faced with difficult decisions. Lot's story teaches us that even in the midst of chaos, it is possible to maintain morality, but it also reminds us of human fragility in the face of extreme circumstances. Lot also represents the tension between being in the world but not of the world. He lived in Sodom, but clearly did not share the values of its inhabitants. This raises a question that many of us face. How can we maintain our moral integrity when we are surrounded by a corrupt environment? Lot shows us that it is possible, although it is a constant challenge. His example encourages us to be firm in our convictions, even when we are in the minority, living in a society that may not share the same principles. An interesting aspect of Lot's story is how he was chosen to be spared from destruction. This was no accident. God recognized your attempts to live a righteous life and rewarded your efforts. However, his salvation was not automatic. Lot had to do his part, following the angel's instructions and leaving behind everything he knew. It makes us reflect on how, in our own lives, we are often called to leave certain things behind to follow a better path. What are we willing to give up in exchange for something greater? Lot's decision to host the angels also reflects a contrast between him and the other inhabitants of Sodom, who viewed the outsiders as either a threat or an opportunity to satisfy their corrupt desires. Hospitality, which should be a common value, has become an exception in a decadent society. Lot, on the contrary, saw in foreigners an opportunity to do good. This makes us think about how we treat those outside our family or social circle. Are we receptive and generous to strangers, or do we allow ourselves to be carried away by fear and prejudice? Another important lesson we can take from Lot's story is about the choices we make regarding where we live and the people we associate with. Lot chose to live in Sodom, a notoriously corrupt city, and this inevitably had consequences for him and his family. Although he maintained his personal integrity, the environment around him was so toxic that he was eventually affected by it. This makes us reflect on our own choices. Are we living in environments that help us grow morally, or are we allowing the corruption around us to wear us down? Furthermore, Lot's escape from Sodom symbolizes the need to leave behind an environment or situation that is beyond redemption. No matter how much he tried to live righteously, the city was doomed, and the only option was to leave. This can be applied to various situations in our lives. Sometimes we need to have the courage to leave a situation that is beyond repair, be it a job, a relationship, or a social circle, and seek a new beginning elsewhere. Lot's hesitation shows us how difficult this decision can be, but also how necessary it is for our own survival. Finally, Lot's story reminds us of the importance of obedience. When the angels instructed him and his family not to look back as they fled, Lot obeyed, but his wife did not. The result was that she turned into a pillar of salt. This image is powerful and serves as a warning. When we are leaving behind a past of destruction and corruption, looking back can trap us in that place from which we tried to escape. Lot moved on, and this ensured his survival. The lesson here is clear. Move forward, don't dwell on the past. Now that we understand Lot's role, let's explore the tragic decision of his wife, who disobeyed and looked back. Lot's wife is one of the most enigmatic and symbolic figures in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. When she disobeyed the order of the angels and looked back, she was turned into a pillar of salt, becoming a marker of disobedience and clinging to the past. This simple act of turning one's face may seem insignificant at first glance, but it carries a profound weight about the consequences of disobeying divine commands. History warns us about the danger of looking back when we are in the midst of crucial change. It makes us reflect on how much we can be stuck in a past that often no longer serves us. The fact that Lot and his family are told not to look back is a powerful metaphor. The idea of not clinging to the past is a principle that we find in different spiritual and philosophical traditions. Lot's wife, by disobeying, symbolizes those who, even when faced with an opportunity for redemption or change, still cling to what is familiar, to what they already know, even if it means remaining in an environment of corruption and decadence. As she turns to watch the destruction of Sodom, she reminds us that often the greatest obstacle to transformation is our own reluctance to let go of the past. The transformation of Lot's wife into a pillar of salt also carries interesting symbolism. Salt, in several cultures, was used as a preservative, a substance that prevents decomposition. However, when turned into salt, Lot's wife becomes a symbol of stagnation, someone who, instead of moving forward and evolving, is preserved in time, trapped in what can no longer be changed. In our own lives, we can become like her, frozen in a state of nostalgia or attachment, unable to move on to new opportunities and new paths. Oftentimes, in times of change, there is a natural temptation to look back. This is because the past, even if imperfect, is familiar to us. The uncertainty of the future can be frightening, and the act of looking back offers temporary comfort. However, the story of Lot's wife teaches us that by giving in to this temptation, we can condemn ourselves to being trapped in a state of paralysis. If we really want to move forward, we need to trust the path ahead, even if it seems uncertain. The story is a reminder that progress requires courage and, above all, faith. What made Lot's wife disobey? Some commentators suggest that his looking back was not just a physical gesture, but a reflection of his emotional and spiritual connection with Sodom. She couldn't completely separate herself from the life she had built there, even though she knew the city was doomed. This raises an important question. How often in our own lives are we so attached to a situation that we refuse to let go of it, even when we know it is harming us? Attachment to what is familiar can be a trap, preventing us from moving on to something better. Furthermore, Lot's wife's disobedience can be seen as a failure of trust. She was given clear instructions not to look back. However, she chose to ignore this guidance, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of doubt. This makes us think about how we often question the directions we receive, whether from authority figures or our own inner sense of morality. When we choose to disobey, we are, in essence, saying that we know better or that we do not believe in the consequences. Her story shows us that this kind of pride or doubt can have devastating results. The figure of Lot's wife also invites us to reflect on the consequences of our seemingly small actions. The simple act of turning your face away had immense consequences, and it makes us think about how, in our own lives, small decisions can have big impacts. Sometimes a single, seemingly harmless choice can put us on a path that completely alters our destiny. This is something we all face in moments of decision, where what seems like a small deviation can actually take us completely away from our goal. Attachment to the past is a recurring theme in human history, and the figure of Lot's wife encapsulates this tendency precisely. Many of us face moments when we need to leave something behind, be it a stage in life, a relationship, or even a way of thinking. When we refuse to do this, we end up remaining stuck in time, like a pillar of salt, unable to grow and adapt to changes. This is something we can see in people who remain stuck in regrets, hurts, or old habits, even though they know that they no longer have a place in their current lives. Finally, the story of Lot's wife is a warning about the danger of disobedience, but it is also a metaphor for the need to move forward. For Lot and his daughters, their escape from Sodom represented a new opportunity, a new beginning, free from the corruption of the city. However, for Lot's wife, this opportunity was lost. As we look at our own lives, we must ask ourselves, are we moving towards a better future, or are we holding on to something that no longer exists? Her disobedience wasn't just physical. It was emotional and spiritual, and that's what makes this lesson so profound. Now that we understand the tragic choice of Lot's wife, we can explore the broader impact of the destruction of these cities as a symbol of divine justice. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is more than a tragic event. It represents a powerful symbol of divine justice. The fall of these cities was an act of purification, in which God decided to cleanse the moral corruption that had become deeply rooted in them. The rain of fire and brimstone that consumed everything serves as a reminder that there are limits to divine tolerance in the face of sin. When a society sinks into transgressions, as happened with Sodom and Gomorrah, justice eventually prevails, even if it takes time. The history of these cities illustrates that destruction can sometimes be the only way to restore order and morality. This event of destruction is not only a tale of God's wrath, but also a lesson in what happens when a community systematically rejects the values of decency and humanity. The corruption of Sodom and Gomorrah was so extreme that the only solution was its total eradication. This act of destruction is therefore a symbol of cleansing, as if God were sweeping the earth of an irreparable stain. This makes us think about the collective consequences of a society that completely deviates from the path of good. The story raises important questions. How far can a community sink before it is considered irretrievable? In the biblical narrative, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is also a warning to future generations. These two places became synonymous with moral decay and the need for divine punishment. Like other great civilizations that fell because of their own failings, these cities now live in collective memory as a reminder that no earthly power can escape the consequences of their actions. When morality is abandoned, decay is inevitable, and the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us that even the most prosperous cities can fall if they neglect ethical principles. A practical example of this lesson can be seen in several civilizations in history that have succumbed to corruption and abuse of power. Think of the Roman Empire, for example, which fell in part because of excess and the loss of core values. Although there was no destruction as literal as that of Sodom, the result was similar. A once mighty society was reduced to ruins. This parallelism helps us see how the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just a religious lesson, but also a political and social warning applicable to this day. However, the destruction of these cities can also be seen as an act of divine mercy. Paradoxically, by eliminating these communities, God was, in a sense, protecting the rest of the world from the destructive influence they could continue to exert. This concept of justice is important because it makes us understand that sometimes what appears to be a severe punishment can, in fact, be a way of protecting the greater good. The symbolism of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is, therefore, a duality between punishment and protection, something we see reflected in many difficult decisions in life. Furthermore, the symbolism of this event echoes the idea that, for the new to flourish, the old needs to be destroyed. This is something we often see in nature. A field that catches fire may appear devastated at the time, but the burned soil ends up becoming more fertile for future growth. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah can be viewed in the same way. By eliminating what was irretrievable, God was preparing the ground for something better, a new chance for humanity to rebuild and learn from the mistakes of the past. The fall of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us that when destruction comes, it does not happen all at once. Before the calamity struck, there were signs, warnings. Abraham's attempts to intercede, the visitation of the angels, Lot's own morality, trying to survive amid decay, all of these elements pointed to imminent deterioration. Likewise, in our lives, we often receive signs that something is out of control before disaster strikes. Ignoring these signs can lead us to the same kind of destruction, whether in a personal, social, or spiritual sense. At the same time, the symbolic destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah points to the idea of a new beginning. After the dust settled, there was an opportunity to learn from that monumental mistake. In many religious traditions, destruction is followed by renewal. In the case of these cities, the catastrophe was a new beginning for humanity, a moment to reflect and seek a better path. This makes us think about how, even after great losses and tragedies in our own lives, there is always the possibility of starting over, of building something new on the ruins of the past. Finally, it is essential to note that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is also a metaphor for the consequences of individual and collective actions. Every choice we make contributes to the construction or destruction of something greater. The actions of the inhabitants of these cities sealed their fate, showing that although it may seem like our everyday decisions are small and insignificant, they can have an immense impact in the long run. The symbolic destruction of these cities teaches us that everything we build, whether it's an empire, a community, or even a personal life, depends on the choices we make every day. Now that we understand the symbolism behind the destruction of these cities, let's explore the impact of the social decline that brought them to this tipping point. The prosperity of Sodom and Gomorrah not only brought material wealth, but also profound moral decline. These cities have become synonymous with arrogance, excesses, and lack of empathy towards those most in need. When a society becomes obsessed with its own comfort and power, it often loses sight of the most basic human values: such as justice, hospitality, and compassion. This was the case with Sodom and Gomorrah. As they grew in wealth and resources, they also grew further away from any sense of moral responsibility. Prosperity, instead of being a blessing, has become a curse. The social decline in these cities was gradual, which reflects how modern societies often fall into similar traps. It is not a change that occurs overnight, but a slow erosion of values. Arrogance and disregard for morality seep into everyday actions, affecting the way people treat each other. In Sodom and Gomorrah, this erosion of values led to indifference to human life, something we can see reflected in various moments in human history when powerful societies began to treat their most vulnerable citizens with contempt. This type of decadence is most visible in times when those with power and wealth isolate themselves in bubbles of privilege, paying no attention to the suffering around them. Sodom and Gomorrah were prosperous cities, but their wealth was used to fuel the selfishness and pride of their inhabitants instead of being channeled for the common good. This rejection of social responsibility was one of the main factors that sealed the fate of these cities. Wealth, without a sense of duty and responsibility toward others, can corrupt even the most prosperous civilizations, a lesson that remains relevant today. What is particularly interesting about the social decline of these cities is the way in which indifference manifested itself. It was not just a matter of individual sins, but a systemic flaw in the way society as a whole operated. The collective arrogance of its citizens, who thought they were invulnerable and immune to judgment, is something we see in many fallen empires throughout history. Unreasonable indulgence and the inability to see beyond one's own needs generate a culture of moral negligence, where the suffering of some is simply ignored. If we look at our own society, there are unsettling parallels. Today, in many places, we see an increase in social inequality, where the richest continue to accumulate more while the poorest struggle to survive. The temptation to look only for one's own benefit can be strong, especially in times of abundance. But the story of Sodom and Gomorrah warns us about the dangers of this mindset. When a society forgets to care for its most vulnerable, it begins to destroy itself from within, and the same can happen to us if we don't pay attention to these signs of decline. The indulgence that gripped Sodom and Gomorrah also reflected a certain kind of moral fatigue. When people become too accustomed to comfort and excess, they begin to lose their sense of right and wrong. The line between moral and immoral becomes blurred, and that is exactly what happened in these cities. They have drowned in their own luxury and arrogance, leaving aside the basic needs of compassion, justice, and human decency. This kind of decadent behavior may seem attractive in the short term, but in the long term, it erodes the social fabric and leads to collapse. To avoid the same fate, it is crucial that modern societies understand the importance of maintaining a balance between material progress and moral responsibility. There is nothing wrong with prosperity in itself, but it must be accompanied by a social conscience. A modern example would be how some corporations are beginning to adopt more responsible policies, such as sustainability programs and philanthropic initiatives. These actions demonstrate that it is possible to grow and prosper without losing sight of our responsibility to others. The social decadence in Sodom and Gomorrah also involved the treatment of foreigners and visitors, as exemplified in the episode where Lot receives angels in his home. Hospitality was a sacred virtue in ancient Middle Eastern cultures, but the inhabitants of these cities violated this norm in brutal ways. The refusal to welcome and protect others was one of the clearest signs of the moral bankruptcy that had taken hold. This disregard for the most fundamental values is one of the reasons these cities have become symbols of what happens when morality is completely ignored. What makes this story even more disturbing is the resistance to repentance. Even when faced with impending judgment, the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah showed no desire to change their ways. This makes us reflect on human nature and our ability to ignore the signs that we are on the wrong path. The history of these cities is a reminder that without honest reflection and a willingness to change, even the most advanced societies are doomed to collapse under the weight of their own mistakes. Now that we understand the depth of social decay in Sodom and Gomorrah, we can analyze Lot's role and how he tried, against all odds, to protect his guests, Lot played a crucial role in the narrative of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, representing the last shred of morality in a completely corrupt city. As Abraham's nephew, Lot had learned the importance of the values of hospitality and justice, something he tried to preserve even amid the moral chaos that surrounded him. When the two angels visited Sodom, Lot welcomed them into his home, doing his best to protect them from the violent mob that surrounded them. This act of hospitality was a reflection of his personal morality, a virtue that contrasted sharply with the decay of the city around him. Lot's attempt to protect his guests, even going so far as to offer his own daughters to the angry mob, is a controversial part of the story, but one that must be seen within the cultural context of the time. Hospitality in the ancient Middle East was a sacred duty, and the protection of guests was considered more important than anything else, even one's own family. Although this action seems inconceivable to us today, it illustrates the gravity of Lot's commitment to honoring his responsibilities as host. He was willing to sacrifice what was most precious to him in the name of a moral obligation that transcended his personal interests. Lot's moral dilemma also raises important questions about the limits of ethics in extreme situations. How far should someone go to protect another human being? In times of crisis, the lines between right and wrong can become blurred, and decisions need to be made quickly based on the values we hold most dear. What we can learn from Lot is that even in impossible situations, maintaining a sense of duty and moral responsibility is crucial. Even though his choices may seem controversial, they are a reminder that in a corrupted world, there is still room for integrity. Lot also symbolizes the struggle of someone living in a decadent society, but still trying to keep their own morality intact. He had chosen to live in Sodom, probably attracted by the city's prosperity, but over time, he must have realized the moral price he was paying for this decision. This leads us to reflect on our own lives. How often are we tempted to make choices that may bring us material benefits, but that compromise our ethical values? Lot's story reminds us that no matter how much corruption we are surrounded by, we still have the power to make moral decisions. Lot's relationship with his community was also tense. Although he had established himself in Sodom, he was never fully accepted by its inhabitants. This becomes evident when he tries to intervene to save the angels, and the crowd ridicules him, treating him like a foreigner. This episode teaches us about the challenge of maintaining upright values in an environment where morality has been abandoned. Lot was a stranger, not only because of his origin, but because of his principles, which differentiated him from the other residents of Sodom. His struggle to maintain his integrity in a hostile environment is a lesson in the price of living according to our values, even when it means moving away from the majority. Lot also teaches us that no matter how hard we try to preserve our morality, there are times when we must recognize that we cannot save everything and everyone around us. When God decided to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot was told to flee, to leave behind everything he knew. This is a harsh lesson. Sometimes the only way to survive and preserve our morality is to cut ties with an environment that has become irretrievable. This story makes us think about situations in our own lives where we might need to do the same. Let go of something we love to preserve what's most important to us. Lot's reluctance to leave the city also reflects the difficulty of giving up what is familiar, even when we know it is best for us. Lot, his wife, and his daughters were instructed not to look back as they fled, which symbolizes the need to move forward without holding on to the past. Lot's hesitation in leaving town and the tragic fate of his wife, who disobeyed and looked back, remind us that attachment to the familiar can often be what keeps us from progressing. To move forward, we need to leave the past behind, even if it means abandoning the comfort of what we already know. Divine intervention to save Lot is also a point of reflection. He was not saved because he was perfect, but because he was morally different from most around him. This teaches us that, in times of crisis, what matters is not perfection, but the continuous effort to do what is right. We can often feel overwhelmed by the flaws and imperfections we have, but Lot's story shows that even with our flaws, we can still be rescued if we keep trying to live up to our values. Lot's role also highlights the importance of listening to signs and acting quickly when necessary. He was warned by angels of impending destruction, but his hesitation nearly cost him and his family their lives. In our own lives, we often receive signs that something is wrong, but we may hesitate to act, whether out of fear, attachment, or uncertainty. Lot's story encourages us to be more attentive to the signs and to act when necessary, without letting procrastination or fear stop us from doing what is right. Now that we understand Lot's role and his lessons, we can turn our attention to his wife's tragic fate and what her disobedience symbolizes. By exploring the 5 sins that led to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, you have not only gained a new understanding about morality and the consequences of our actions, but you have also received an invitation to self-reflection. What behaviors and choices have you observed in your life that may be aligned with these sins? Have you ever stopped to consider the impact of your actions on the community around you? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just a warning about the past. It is a reflection on the present and a warning for the future. What changes can you implement in your everyday life to avoid a similar path? Sometimes the simplest decisions, like showing compassion or practicing hospitality, can have a powerful ripple effect. And most importantly, how can you become an agent of change in your own community? The lessons learned here invite us to not only look at ourselves, but also challenge those around us to do the same. So, how about starting today? Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to keep learning about these topics that really matter. Together, we can build a more conscious and responsible future